The Bob Murphy Show, episode 382.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I am joined again by Sheldon Richman, who's going to explain to us why he doesn't like this trend among some of us that I've been participating in, where we use the term corporate to denote something dubious, as in the term specifically corporate media, in my case, that I've picked it up. So we talk all about that. In case you don't know him, Sheldon Richman is the executive editor of the Libertarian Institute and a contributing editor at antiwar.com, and his latest books are Coming to Palestine and What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. So here's my discussion about the term corporate with Sheldon Richman. Sheldon, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show.
Very happy to be back. Always good to see you.
Nice seeing you as well. So you are here to defend the honor of the adjective corporate. So maybe before we start getting into the particulars, can you just step back a bit and explain to people, why are you dying on this hill?
Well, it's a kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I think it's more serious than peeve might imply. I've been noticing people saying, and this is mainly coming from people who would regard themselves as progressive and left, but libertarians are picking it up. And they're using the word corporate as not just a neutral adjective or to describe a form of business, but as a pejorative, as a negative. Most often it's used before the word media, talking about the old media, right? The pre-kind of internet media, ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, the usual. And there's plenty of grounds for disparaging them. You can call them the regime media, the mainstream. There's plenty of terms to use. But I noticed more and more people use corporate media. And like I say, libertarians are picking that up. And what began to bug me about it, I don't know if I noticed it right away, but Glenn Greenwald uses it a lot, for example. And I think it was first when my ears finally perked up and said, hang on a second, something's not right about that. Because for any problem you can name about the mainline media, the legacy media, there's another term, may be very valid grounds. Plenty of criticism is warranted. But the problem is not that they're corporate. Now, I don't think when people use that term, they simply mean, oh, it's the corporate form. The shares are publicly traded. There's a board of directors, stuff like that. They've incorporated in some state. They filed some, articles of incorporation. That's not what they mean. So I think it's just a pejorative, and I think it's subtly, since it begins among the anti-capitalist progressives, it's a jab at markets and capitalism. And I don't believe those people make a big distinction between crony capitalism and free market capitalism or the market economy. And so for libertarians to pick it up, I think they become implicit critics of the marketplace because they've adopted this. And corporate is now a dirty word. Why is it a dirty word? No one's ever given me an answer. When I wrote about this, I got criticism from libertarians saying, don't you realize all the privileges corporations get? And I kept saying, name one that corporations get qua corporation. And no one ever did it. They came up with stuff that turns out to be wrong, or they make a criticism that it doesn't even have any content. Mm-hmm. So that's what's called.
Okay. All right. So good. And yes, we are going to get into all that stuff, but let's just first start. And partly why I wanted to have you on, Sheldon, to talk about this when you told me this was something you were thinking about and writing on at this stage is I started using that term corporate media, and I distinctly remember why or what the event was. As I was listening, it was Michael Malice was being interviewed by somebody. I can't remember I think it might have been Glenn Greenwald actually, but I'm not certain about that. But it was some, big name interview with Michael, and this was years ago. And Malice explained why he used that term.
Oh,
And it convinced me. So I'll do my best. I didn't go dig up the clip. In a perfect world, I would have done that to refresh my memory.
mhm.
I'm hoping I get across, his actual justification and I'm not botching it. So we're not attacking a straw man. But for sure, that's why I started using it. Because what had happened, just to give the listeners, especially the younger folks, some context is, believe it or not, it used to be the case that NBC and MSNBC and ABC and CBS, that was where you had to go. And I even remember when Fox News came on the scene, and they had an article like that was taking the side of loggers, or not an article, a news segment taking the side of loggers. This was like 25 years ago, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, there's a major network that's pro logger and not for the Spotted Owl or something. And so I'm just saying, like, how much what we would now call the progressive left controlled the news stream back in the day was amazing. But and so for a while, once internet alternatives became available, we would refer to them as the mainstream media, kind of like Austrians sometimes talk about the mainstream, by which they mean, neoclassical people teaching at MIT or something. But then after a while, we thought that's giving them too much credit. Like now, most Americans do not go to CBS to get their news. They'd be crazy. Nobody would do that. And so we thought we're giving them too much credit by calling them the mainstream media. And so we were searching around for some, and you're right, like legacy media is one thing, but so Malice, when again, I can't remember who it was, but he was explaining he was using corporate media. And for sure, one of the things he said is, besides that, it just happens to be true. Like, given right now, the news that we trust and the news that we don't trust, and the corporate happens to describe the people that we don't. He liked it because he thought it would put the leftist in a bind that, since you're right, Sheldon, their knee-jerk reaction is not to trust corporations, that because at that moment in history, Malice thought we need to get these people to realize, stop trusting what these journalists and the New York Times and whatever is telling you. And, they're calling us conspiracy theorists or whatever. Why are you trusting them? After all, they're just big business producing what is profitable. You know what I mean? So that's why he was using it, that he thought that was a way to sort of peel the leftist progressives who were true believers away from supporting these institutions that, would happen to be going against libertarians at that point. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I'm just, I started using that. And now that I read your article, I'm like, yeah, I kind of knew what your point was.
I think that's short-sighted and self-defeating. Malice was recently interviewed by John Stossel, and I never heard anybody ever ask, why do you call it corporate media, until Stossel asked Malice.
Oh, okay.
So this is pretty fresh. You say from a few years ago what you saw. This is just the week before last.
Oh, okay.
And so his answer, Malice's answer, and Stossel didn't push back further. He just let him have his answer, and then they moved on. He said, well, I don't want to sound partisan, Republican or Democrat or left and right. This is kind of what he said. This is almost verbatim. But he said, the left has long understood, this is Malice speaking now, the left has long understood that that corporations are not our friend. And I say, hang on, what are you talking about? That sounds, first of all, very collectivist. There are a lot of corporations, and they produce goods that we love and use every day and wouldn't want to do without. In fact, maybe even have a hard time doing without. What the heck does that mean? Corporations are not our friends. Amazon's my friend. Now, I realize Amazon has some military contracts or whatever. Sure, in the world today, a lot of companies, it's not because they're corporations, but a lot of companies have contracts with government. We have big government, unfortunately. And so lots of companies have various kinds of contracts. But corporations, as a blanket statement, make our lives much, much better. And anyone who wants to know the details on this, I recommend Tyler Cowen's book, Big Business, Love Letter to an American Anti-Hero, or something like that. Full of data with footnotes to studies showing what a great thing corporations have been for us as consumers and also as investors. Because modest, small to medium investors have been able to get decent returns through the corporate form. So there's nothing you can say about these companies that relates to the fact that they're corporations. I think Ayn Rand used the term definition by non-essentials. So to say they're bad because they're corporations, or to simply use the word corporate to define any company you don't like, it's not qua corporation. That's not the problem. It's not because they sell, their shares are available publicly and anybody can buy them and sell them at any time. You don't need to notify the company. That's a wonderful thing. You don't like the company? I sell the shares. It's not because they have a board of directors. None of the things. And so another thing, when I challenged Malice on X about it, he said they're self-serving. We wouldn't believe anything that's said in a corporate press release. Well, first of all, self-serving is not enough. Is it dishonestly self-serving? I don't care about self-serving. A sole proprietorship who puts out and it says we're the best restaurant in town, that's self-serving. That may not be, it's not a corporation, right? One guy could own a little restaurant, pizzeria or something, and say we're the best in town. So it has nothing to do with being a corporation. And what counts is whether it's dishonest or not what's wrong with being self-serving if it's honest self-serving, right? So that was not a very good answer. And besides, why should you believe a press release from a partnership? That's going to be self-serving. Oh, but it's not the corporate form. I guess that means okay. So you see what I mean? There's no there. That's you're hitting something, not the target you have in mind. But by doing it, you're feeding the anti-free market left, because they don't like corporations simply because they don't like corporations. They don't like any business. They would do away with business if they could. So that's my complaint. And I don't think there's been a good answer.
Okay, so I totally get what you're saying, and I probably agree with you, but I'm going to push back again, like being a devil's advocate or being Malice's advocate.
Please do.
Because I understand where he's coming from, and that's partly the point of this episode, is to try to flesh this out. So I think what he has in mind is in context of what you're saying there, you interacting with him, and then what he said to Stasso. I think he's saying something like, you're right. In general, sole proprietors, you would think would be saying things that are favorable to their business or whatnot, but they might be honest and also like an entertainer or something. Like you could imagine somebody who's a music icon or a stand-up comedian or something, and they're doing show, and people could ask them stuff in interviews, and they occasionally might admit something that technically hurts their career, but they're just being honest or whatever. Whereas if you're talking to the media contact for a large corporation, there's no way in the world that what they're saying to you is what that person believes. Like that's clearly the corporate line. And so it's almost like it's a government in that sense. And it's like filtering. And this relates to, I've also seen a popular Malice quote is something like, we'll know that we won when the average American views a corporate journalist with the same disdain as a tobacco company executive. So something like that.
It's just
right?
so imprecise. Look,
hang on. But do you get what he's saying? And your problem is just that may happen to be true.
I don't really get what he's saying.
10 corporations that come to mind, but it's not a general.
Look, Coke Industries is not a corporation, right? You can't buy stock in Coke Industries. So he would say, well, I don't believe their press person or their press release. So it must not be because you're a corporation. A non-corporation can act like a corporation. It's not qua corporation. A corporation is an association of people. It's a particular kind of association. Why do you focus on that?
Well, again, but in fairness, so if he says, I wouldn't let a saber-toothed tiger babysit my 3-year-old, you wouldn't say, but you also wouldn't let, a serial rapist do it either. So it's not that it's a saber-tooth. It's like, no, it isn't that it's a saber-tooth. I'm not saying that's the only thing I wouldn't trust. So there, like the Coke industry thing, I don't think that knocks out. You have to give me an example of a corporation that you would trust their media person, right? In order to show. He's not saying the only institution I don't trust is corporations. He's just saying.
But it's not because it's a corporation. Any statement from a company, a company wants to make sales. It wants to look good in front of the public. And so you should bring a natural skepticism into advertising, for example, whether it's a corporation or not. Of course, they're going to say it's the best in town. Is it really the best in town? Well, it may be good, but that's very debatable. Why wouldn't you bring the same skepticism? Again, I think it's imprecise. It's like aiming a dart at a dartboard, and you're not even hitting the dartboard. You're hitting something that's completely irrelevant and saying, "Aha, I've scored." But it has nothing to do with the corporate form. There's nothing inherently dishonest about the corporate form. It just means you can buy shares, and they have a board of directors. It's, those kinds of, and you've incorporated in the state. You filed articles of incorporation. That none of that's inherently privilege laden or dishonest. The fact that anybody selling something is going to put the best light and maybe even out and out lie. I'm not saying trust them, but it's not because they're a corporation. Why wouldn't you apply the same standards to any company? To anybody who's selling something, he's going to put the best light on it and maybe try to hope that something negative doesn't come out if he's done something that would be that the public wouldn't like. It just seems imprecise, and plus it's feeding the anti-market sentiment that the progressives
let me do one more on like the cultural thing, and then we'll go into the more economics of it. Another thing that's similar, I think, is the term suit. So you can imagine, like I even tweet like this sometimes. I'm doing it tongue in cheek, but I can't think of a good example. But I might say so, like retweet somebody talking about something on Twitter, and I'll say, oh yeah, I was going to do this too until the suits at corporate told me I had to knock it off or something like that. You know what I mean? It's like the man keeping you down. And so clearly, it's not that the act of putting on a suit changes your behavior or whatever. But there is do you understand what people mean if they talk about oh yeah, I'm trying to make a movie here, and then the suits come in and they say I got to do this casting decision and I'm over budget, and
but that's more slang. That's more slang. And if the Tailors Association of America rose up and said, "Please don't say that. There's nothing wrong with suits," I kind of understand it. But suits more slang than corporate. That's supposed to be descriptive as well as normative, kind of rolled into one. This is bad. This is bad. I don't think suit is quite the same thing. Obviously, no one's going to think he's smearing the suit, or he wants suits outlawed or government regulation of suits.
Right.
I don't think people are going to make that mistake. The corporation is a great thing. That doesn't mean I like any particular corporation, but it was an amazing. You don't really want to call it an invention because it did emerge slowly in the, beginning 16th, 17th century. But people confuse it with the old corporate charter that kings used to give, right? They'd say, like, to you, Bob, you want a monopoly on playing cards here in England? Okay, but we want tax money in return. We want something in return, quid pro quo. So it was a charter that said you can have this privilege. We won't let anybody compete with you, but we want something in return. Yeah, kings did that. That was bad. That was like a special, incorporation. And in the United States, we had that not quite the same way, where a company would be chartered to build a canal or something like that, or a road. And so, and I'm sure no one was allowed to set up one nearby, which might cut into the revenue of the one that got a special grant. But that's confusing one type of company, which is definitely state related, to general incorporation, which comes in the 1850s or so, where anybody can incorporate. It's not a privilege. It just means you're filing papers. It's not a charter. It's articles of incorporation. You're saying whether it's going to last for a certain amount of time or whether you intend it to be perpetual, which means you don't need to renew the articles. List your board of directors. Does stuff like that, and then you pay your $200 or whatever it is. I don't know what it costs. And the government can't turn you down. So it is not a grant. And so we shouldn't stigmatize it. I'm against stigmatizing the word corporate. Corporate has done great things. Corporations have done great things for consumers. Look, you can't have mass, as Brian Kaplan likes to say, you can't have mass consumption without mass production. And it's pretty hard to have mass production without big companies. And big companies raise a lot of capital from people spread all over the place. And that's good for the investors, maybe small, medium investors. People have 401ks that own stock. They're all capitalists. Rothbard praised the corporation in Man, Economy, and State. Mises praised the corporation in human action because of it's a godsend, especially to consumers, but also to investors, because they don't have to go out. It's like a bank being an intermediary, right? You little saver don't have to go out and find a bunch of other savers and say, hey, let's pool our money. You don't have to set up an investment club like some people do. You might want to do that, fine. But you don't have to do that. Corporation's done it for you. And if you don't like what the corporation does, you just sell. You don't need to inform anybody, notify anybody. You just call your broker or whatever you're doing today. It's all on apps. You sell your stock, buy something else. So I don't think it should be stigmatized. And I think there's a subliminal message there that the left, I hate to use left and right because those are such empty terms these days, but that the progressive anti-market people are very happy to do that stigmatizing, and they must love it that libertarians have signed on to it. We would be all worse off, poorer, if corporations were abolished.
Okay, so the way you are using the term is functionally that a corporation is just an entity that, well, it's a business that its ownership is consists of shares of stock that can be sold in principle, on an open market, and it's publicly owned, and that's the distinction between like private and public ownership. And what they mean, they don't mean government owned.
Right.
And that's so that's how you're using the term, and you're saying, given that, just like there's not some animus people have towards partnerships, like, oh, everything should be, you can trust a sole proprietor, but those partnerships you got to watch out for. We don't talk like that, so why should we have this hostility or suspicion of a corporation?
And it's all the result of contract. Look, the book I want to recommend, it's not really visible, is Robert Hesson. Robert Hesson was a great libertarian, business historian, early friend of Murray Rothbard, Leno Liggio, Ralph Raico. He was at Circle Bastia in that early group. He died not that long ago. He wrote a book in 1979, which you can still find, called In Defense of the Corporation. Now, in 1979, his main nemesis in this book was Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, for a very long time, had a crusade for national chartering of corporations because he thought corporations are getting all these benefits, and what do they give back? Forget about the goods and services they make. What are we getting for their corporate charter? Which was a bogus question, but he was pushing for federal legislation that would nationally charter all corporations and impose all kinds of obligations on them. It was crazy. It was a typical Naderite, basically socialist kind of thing. Hesson demolishes him. It's not a very thick book, you can see, but he demolishes him. But to do that, first of all, he needs to validate the corporate form, which he does beautifully. And there's one very clever bit in here where he shows the evolution of a hypothetical company from a sole proprietorship that begins as one guy owning it, and then who brings on a couple of close friends who become then partners. And he does it step by step, all by contract, to a corporation. And there's no government grants, there's no government favoritism or privileges. All they do is then register with the Secretary of State or whatever state they're in, pay their, I don't know what it costs, but probably some kind of nominal fee. And that's it. And he shows how they do it. People should get the book and take a look at it. It's all by contract. And so there are no libertarian grounds for saying corporations bad. And I think Rothbard was right. I think Mises was right. And I think us pro-corporation libertarians, I mean, it sounds bad because you think, oh, corporations, big business, links to government, but that's not inherent, right? You can imagine a corporation that doesn't have links to government. It may be really tough these days because the government has its hands in everything. And so just to be able to navigate and exist, you can't help but deal with the government. There's the famous story about Microsoft that never had a presence in Washington, D.C., and then they got hit with the big antitrust suit in 1980, and that ended that policy. Gates realized, no, I got to have full-time lobbyists in D.C. I may not be interested in Washington, but Washington is interested in me. And so that changed everything. So it's tough to be in business, especially a sizable business. Because there's no way you can't just say I'm going to avoid the government altogether. I'm just going to go about my business and present and produce goods for consumers. You wouldn't last 2 minutes like that. But that's unfortunately the mixed economy we live in. Where the free market
it's funny when you were talking about having to file with the Secretary of State. I realized my company, Consulting by RPM, is an S corporation, and so I don't know if that makes me inherently evil.
Yeah, no, maybe they'll make exceptions for S corporations, and I forget the criteria for S corporations. It's a smaller thing.
Yeah.
But let's remember, corporations is rather than getting privileges, get anti-privileges. They have to pay a corporation income tax.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know that a corporation doesn't really pay a tax. Even if the government levies it on the corporation, you and I and other people who are interested in economics know that where the government, the designated target is not who necessarily pays the tax. And so I know economists have done a lot of work on this over the years. A corporate tax is paid by shareholders, consumers, and workers, because one way or another, depending on the particulars of that industry and supply and demand and all that stuff, elasticity and all that, it's going to get allocated differently depending on the situation. The corporation itself doesn't pay a tax. A corporation, it's not a person. People have to pay the tax. There's no corporation to tax.
Well, okay, so that's an interesting thing. You actually jumped right into the next thing. So I actually have seen some principled libertarians, and I know you have too, and that's why I want to go this route with the discussion, objecting to the corporate form. And so that's one thing they say is, no, by its very nature, it's this legal fiction that it's a person. And shouldn't that just offend your sensibilities, Murphy, that, clearly that's not something that would originate. You can't just with contracts create a person like that's, people transferring property titles and whatnot voluntarily through contract, but a corporation is the state designating this thing that, the McDonald's corporation is a thing in and of itself. It's like a person that lives, that's immortal. And isn't that weird?
Well, but according to Hessen, that's not special to the corporate form. Partnerships can appoint trustees to act so that the partnership is acting as an entity. That's not specific or exclusive to a corporation. Corporations, a corporation, as a matter of convenience, can sue. But at the same time, it can be sued. So that's a double-edged sword. You don't have to name every, stockholder, or you can just name the corporation. But as Hessen points out, the entity status is not necessary to the corporate form, because since it all can come out of contract, it's what he calls the inherence theory, that it's all the result of contract. And these other, but even, appointing trustees to buy property and stuff like that, that's all contract. Contracts can be very creative and inventive, and people, entrepreneurs come up with things that the rest of us never think of, because they're looking to make profit, and that coming up with these different ideas about management can do that. So that's not special. Now, Hessen does point out that in fact, the entity theory can lead to bad consequences. So example he gives, which he says should be considered illegitimate, not sure what the courts do, but an individual, a sole proprietorship, can let's say his company does damage, his truck runs over some people. So these are torts, right? He's now being sued. And if he would have set up a one-man corporation and undercapitalize it, in other words, keep most of his assets private and only to a small extent capitalize the corporation and say have no liability insurance, Hessen says the court should recognize that as a fraud, because he's responsible. It's a one-man corporation, so by definition, he is responsible, even if it's an employee of his. He's responsible. And so for him to hide behind a one-man corporation and say, well, you can sue the entity, but it only has $50 and it's still, but you can't go after my bank account, that should not be recognized. And again, I'm not sure if it is or not. Hessen isn't quite clear whether that's done, but if it's done, that's not what I mean. And that's not necessary to the corporation. So a lot of people will point to tort limited liability as there's the privilege. You hear some people say that. It's funny, Malice and others don't say that, but a few people in commenting on my article said, well, what about limited liability? Well, first of all, there's two kinds of limited liability. Limited liability in contracts is contractual by definition. If it's in contracts, it's contractual. So, I can lend you money and it can say in there, if you default, I can sue your company, the corporation, but I can't go after your personal assets. If I agree to that, okay, I agree to that. I must like the terms. If I don't like the terms, I'll lend money to somebody else. But the other part, so that's not a problem. The incorporation, your papers of incorporation are just announcing to the world in contracts and debt. Limited liability is our rule. We have the word limited after our LLC or something after our name. So we're just announcing to the world rather than having negotiate in every contract. We just say, if you want to do business with us, we're a limited liability corporation. So you're on notice. Now the other kind of limited liability is tort, where there is no contract, obviously, right? My truck with the driver I've hired has run into a crowd of people by accident, and now they want to sue, and is the driver the only person responsible? Where the Old English rule, and Hessen discusses this, is that the master is responsible for the servant. In Latin, it's called respondeat superior, right? The superior must answer for what the subordinate has done. So the people in the company, the corporation who has hired him and oversees him and supervises him are also liable. Vicarious liability would make sense. But someone who owns 10 shares of Microsoft, if a Microsoft truck or Amazon truck runs over somebody, some little old lady who owns 10 shares, should you be able to go after her bank account? She had no authority. She wasn't supervising people. And so that does not make sense. But Hessen makes another point, and you might want to argue about all that. I don't think that strikes any kind of fatal blow at the corporation. But as Hessen points out, it's a moot point. Because the big concern is with the great corporations, right? The big ones. Are people really concerned about if a restaurant down the street is organized as a corporation? Is that what they mean? They're not going to pick it. Corporate restaurants, don't go to corporate restaurants. You don't hear that. The big corporations, that liability issue never kicks in because, first of all, great corporations have great assets. That's what makes it a great corporation. They have a huge amount of assets. They're not hiding their assets in the personal pockets of the board of directors. The company has assets. Plus, they have a lot of liability insurance because they don't want to have, because of obvious reasons. So that's a moot point. That's not like the big, people will name that, but that's not the big complaint about corporations.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You're not hearing about that.
Yeah. The libertarian intellectuals that, and this was years ago. I was down, I think I was in grad school at the Mises Institute, and there were other fellows down there, and some of them were against the corporate form. And that is one thing they brought up. So I was going to bring it up if you didn't already do it yourself, is the idea of the LLC, that basically they were concerned that, yes, an individual, if he goes out and does something, for sure, the victims can sue him and take up to all of his assets. Oh, but if he and a bunch of his buddies form an LLC, now can they do things in the name of the corporation? And there's that shield, and all that somebody can do is sue and get just whatever the corporate treasury has, and their personal assets are safe. And so I think it's similar to what you just said there, Sheldon. The way I handled that is, look, I don't know enough about the real world to say exactly how that would play out in today's courts. And if it is like that, I agree. I don't support that. But I thought
that looks like fraud.
Yeah. In a genuinely free market, I thought
if you take away the entity theory, then it's harder to make that case. And the corporation does not need the entity theory because it comes out of contracts. Therefore, you don't need the government to create, in effect, create an entity, a fictitious person.
Right. So yeah, what I said to them was, yes, it's a group of guys come together and they're gonna do something. But if they want to get other people to invest in their enterprise, they're certainly allowed to do one-off contracts with those outside investors to say, you're going to give us this amount of money. You own 1% in our company. And we all agree, if we do something that gets us in trouble legally with other people, all you can do is lose what you handed over to us. We agree to that. Those are the terms we agreed to. And to me, that seemed okay. Like I didn't see any problem with that per se, but it was still, though, the original people, like there had to be somebody in the corporate entity that would bear the brunt of, tort, liability or whatever, that they couldn't all hide behind a corporate shield, is the way I was thinking of it.
Right.
So anyway,
and it's an old English principle. It's not something just thought up now ad hoc. I mean, it goes back a long way. where the master is, I mean, the way they put it, the master was responsible for the servant. That's an old principle.
Okay. All right. So I guess another element is, you had brought this up also in your article, is this issue of, the corporations, when they get to be so big, they're, it's like an old boys network, and they're not even operating in the interest of the little shareholder. Like you kind of even said it yourself, the old lady there who owns a little bit, she has no control over what the company's doing, the corporation's doing. So doesn't that prove that something's wrong with this model? That she's technically an owner,
Right.
She should have control.
Well, that's an old criticism. Going back to the 30s, there was a famous book by Adolf Burley and Gardner Means. I think they were kind of New Dealers who did a famous book about the flaws of the corporation and this separation of ownership and management. And but what they miss, and what Hessen points out, and it seems an obvious thing too, is people invest in a corporation. I mean, the average investor in a corporation don't want to manage a business. I mean, there's a division of labor and a division of interests. I want to put money into a company and, try to make some return for, future years. I don't want to manage a company. And one of the great conveniences of the corporation is that it's a vehicle for investors, savers, on the modest end, although they don't have to be on the modest end, but they can still be fairly small, who don't want to run a company. How many people want the responsibility of running a company? So it's a harmony of interests. It's an exchange, and as we know, exchange is for mutual benefit. Two sides come together, and they each are giving something that the other wants more than they're giving up. So what's wrong with that? One of Nader's ideas was he wanted the government to compel corporations to every month pepper the stockholders with all kinds of paperwork, so they know that everything that's going on, because he claimed the shareholders don't know, they're kept in the dark, they don't know, and so he wanted them like inundated with stuff. Well, first of all, just because you inundate somebody doesn't mean they're going to read it. And I have a feeling most people are not going to be reading it. Look, I get some of these things by email now, right? You get like quarterly reports. I don't read them. You can if you want to. But I don't intend to be an active shareholder in some of these things. So it's a typical, social engineer kind of thing that Nader was guilty of, thinking, I'm going to do a great service for the shareholders. I'm going to make sure they get a blizzard of paper and this was before the internet, right? The blizzard of paper every month, and I'm sure they're going to be studying and reading and casting intelligent votes. And most people probably don't vote on board of directors, or they just sign over their proxies. The thing is, if they don't like the company, they can sell right then on a moment's notice without telling anybody, without anybody's permission. That's the ultimate. And there are professionals out there who are giving you information about this company stinks, sell. There's all kinds of plus there's, on top of the corporate form, we have mutual funds and index funds and all these things that make it easier and relatively safer for the person that's not looking to be a day trader, and he's giving up great gains because he's more conservative in how much risk he wants to take, so he's making this trade-off. It's easier than ever. I mean, our friend, I think our mutual friend Gene Epstein has talked about quite a bit about this, about how well you can do just putting your money in an index fund. You don't really have to know anything. So entrepreneurs are working overtime to serve us, and a lot of them are incorporated. So the corporation is doing good things for us.
And the other delicious aspect of that is, I know you know this, but just to drive home, I think I emphasize this in my Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, is to say, okay, let's take the worst case scenario. And yet there's this board of directors and they've been installed and they're making decisions that, they're paying the CEO a ridiculous bonus and all this kind of stuff. And they're just, they're just taking trips and going on corporate outings and golfing and whatever. It's just crazy. They're not really husbanding the resources of the shareholders, and the shareholders don't know what's going on. And right. And so that company that's operating like that is a ripe target for a corporate raider, a hostile
Yeah,
takeover.
a takeover. And what does the government do? The government gets in the way. We had takeovers with Michael Milken and so, quote, junk bonds, which was, that's a real term I know in the field, but it then became a pejorative.
It's also called a
It used
high
to
yield
just
bond.
mean, it just mean high risk, but high yield. And it was a pretty standard kind of investment. But Milken and those people made it, kind of democratized it, and also made it possible for small companies to buy it, to take over big companies. Then people got mad. As long as big companies were taking over small, it wasn't, you didn't hear much. I mean, maybe the antitrust people didn't like it, but the Wall Street didn't mind. It was when Milken, the uppity Milken, helped smaller companies, upstarts, take over big companies that people got mad. And then, the government, what was it called? Is it called the Harrison Act or Harrison-Williams Act? Maybe it's the Williams Act. If you acquire 15% of a corporation because you're planning to do a takeover because it's being run poorly, you then have to, once you get to 15%, you have to announce your intentions. In other words, you couldn't be secret anymore, which of course is going to raise the price of the stock. Right. And so there's where the old line corporations got the government to step in and protect them. That's totally wrong. They ought to repeal all those things. I'm a big fan of Henry Manny, the late Henry Manny, a great economist. George Mason, law and economics guy, the George Mason Law School for a long time, who did a lot of writing on the market for corporate control, he called it. And that's a very important part, which protects investors, but also protects consumers and makes sure that scarce resources are being used in the way consumers most want it. And so you can't just sit back. We have this idea that CEOs, they don't do anything. They're making millions of dollars a year. They sit on each other's boards and appoint each other, hire each other. It's a great old boys network. That's nonsense. Why would they be spending millions of dollars so a guy can, golf 6 days a week? I mean, does that make any sense? Doesn't make sense.
Well, right. And then again, to the extent that you do think, you'd say, well, what? Surely regulators, you say, no, if that were happening, that's a company that would be ripe. Because we kind of jumped into it, but for people at home, folks, what a hostile takeover means is that some group comes in from the outside and they convince the existing shareholders to sell some of their shares to the takeover people voluntarily. So it's not hostile to the owners of the company. It's hostile to the entrenched management that doesn't want new people coming in and laying some of them off and changing the direction of the business. And so for it to be profitable to do that, and so how could it be? They're clearly giving a higher price to the existing shareholders than the current market price. Otherwise, why would you sell? And so those people are better off. The existing shareholders are better off. And then why would they go through the trouble of raising the money to go do this? Because they are looking at that company, its assets and so on, and how it's being run, and said, with those assets, we could do a better job. We could have higher dividends or net income or what have you. And maybe that involves getting rid of some of this bloated management. So that's why it's hostile, because the management realizes, there's a new sheriff in town.
Yeah.
And that's Sheldon's saying. So they go to the regulators and the Wall Street Journal and gin up stories about, this Michael Milken guy, he's a bad character. We got to watch out for people like him, and put all these regulatory roadblocks in the way of a quote hostile takeover.
And in the heyday, those people were really disparaged by the mainstream media, right? They were called corporate raiders. Hostile already.
There was that
hostile. It wasn't hostile for the shareholders. Yeah. It was hostile for the job holders, not the shareholders.
Yeah.
But they just raiders. They used all these negative terms, and yet you had a lot of bloated companies that had bought. I don't know if it was the monetary theory exactly what set off. Exxon at one point was buying like office furniture division, and it really consolidated stuff. Things really far from energy, oil, and later ended up divesting itself a lot of that. It was like they were bad moves. They weren't making money on it, and maybe to ward off some kind of takeover, they said we better get rid of these divisions. We're losing money. This maybe we thought it looked like a good idea at the time, but it doesn't look too good now. This is the Mises principle in action, right? Mises' whole point is that resources are scarce and consumers kind of have priorities. There's some things they'd rather get produced, before other things. And of course, it's very diverse because you're talking about a lot of consumers. We put it in very abstract terms. The market channels resources and labor to where consumers want it most. Well, that's very, very abstract. That almost makes it sound like it's just, it's almost like literally an invisible hand, right? No, but it's actually people on the ground making decisions. I mean, this is what your point, your book's called Choice, right? It's people making, I'm not telling you, obviously, Bob.
Right.
But this is how one way it works. It's one of the ways that the resources get, they say, no, that's a mistake to put the resources there. Consumers seem to want the stuff here. Well, actually, people have to actually do things. And hostile takeover, as they called it, was one of the methods. I mean, that puts kind of the flesh on the necessity and bones about how these things actually work out. Living, breathing people making decisions, not just impersonal forces. We talk about personal forces very often. It's people doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to remember that. And, I'm waiting for someone to tell me what's wrong with the corporation.
Well, you alluded to it in your opening remarks, but can you just tell them if they say, okay, sure, but tell us what's good about it? Like, why don't we just have partnerships or, do other things? What is it that the corporate
for one thing,
form,
and this is, I'm saying if, but in fact, it's true. If it all comes out of contract, what are the grounds for stopping it? It's free contract. There's no coerced parties. So as libertarians, we're for freedom of contract. It's freedom of association. Contract just means it's more formalized with, actually written out, but it's an association. When, and I'll give Glenn Greenwald credit on this. He's unlike a lot of his colleagues, he favors the Citizens United decision, which let corporations spend as much money as they want on, well, there are limits, unfortunately, on political campaigns. In other words, they can give to PACs, independent PACs. They can't give as much as to a candidate. But as far as a PAC goes, promoting a candidate, citizens.
What is that political action committee? Is that what that stands for?
A political action committee. Yeah, right. So they're not these PACs. I mean, I'm not an expert on election law. They can't coordinate with the candidate. However, they can run independent campaigns.
Right.
That's obviously there are ways to coordinate without directly sitting down in a room. But anyway, most left wingers, let's call them, hate that. They hate Citizens United.
Right.
Corporations can give huge amounts of money to on behalf.
Get the corporate money out of politics. Come on, this is for the people, not the corporations.
But Glenn sees it as a First Amendment issue, and it's funny how leftists get mad when you say corporations are people. They get mad at you. Mm-hmm. Why? What are they? What else could it be? Is it some kind of the day the Earth stood still, the robot that came off the ship, Klaatu or whatever his name is? I mean, is that a corporation? No, it's people associating and doing things. So it's the result of contract. What it does for us is, first of all, like I said, again, I'm stealing the words of Brian Kaplan. You can't have mass consumption without mass production. And as he goes further to say, there's never been a case of mass production that only benefited a small segment of society. That's a contradiction. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense.
Right. If you're going to have like big factories cranking out cars, it can't just be for millionaires. It's got to be for the masses. Otherwise, you can crank them out. Yeah.
It doesn't happen. And so mass production became much easier with the corporate form because, again, you can raise a lot of small investment contributions, let's call them, from lots of shareholders, but spread over the whole country or the world, and they're all doing better than they would do if they were stuck with making little just little savings here and there, because it's pooled, and so you get this big operation, and even though they may be getting a small percentage, they're getting a small percent. The investors are getting a small percentage of a very big number, rather than a larger percentage of a much, much, much smaller number. So it's not, I mean, that's why it's attractive. That's why people put retirement, funds in vehicles like that. So you get amazing production for mass consumption, and you get an amazing way for people to channel their savings into that mass production, which they're benefiting in two ways, as consumers and as savers. What's not to like?
Yeah, that it ties into a point back when I was working for the Institute for Energy Research, and occasionally, especially when oil prices were high, people would rail against the profits of big oil and so we would go in and just get standard stuff showing that you know who owns the big oil companies? You do. And,
Yeah.
because if you own, if you own a pension, if you have a pension or you got a 401k, it's probably in this kind of a fund, and, they own blah, 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 so anyway, it was just, so yeah, these large corporations, even if individuals don't directly own stock in them, but they could, there's nothing stopping you from buying stock in Exxon or whatever. But surely most Americans, to the extent that they have a retirement account that's managed by some, higher entity, they probably do have exposure to energy stocks or whatever. So anyway, that's
well, and that's where some of this ESG has been so damaging, right? Because some people that oversee investments have been kind of intimidated into not going for the highest return for their clients, but rather for going for the socially responsible. It's like DEI kind of thing. Go to a company not that has a great return, but that checks most of the boxes in the woke checklist. Hopefully that's being reversed in different places. I think it's kind of lost favor.
Maybe this is the place to plug it in here. Just on this general point about, corporations are just people, and this kind of ties into methodological individualism. This is a point that Austrians make a lot, that, hey, it's kind of shorthand when we say Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. That really it was, officials in the Japanese government or military that gave orders, and then individuals flying the planes throughout that's it. But I did see some pushback. I think Gene Callahan was the one that made me first realize this. So I just want to get your reaction. And he wasn't denying that, yeah, you got to be aware of the fact that it's not that the government is this acting entity or something, that, it's important to understand that as social scientists. But on the other hand, there is a place for treating institutions as a separate thing from just the people who happen to compose it. And I don't remember if these were Gene's examples, but once he got, like, you can talk about the LA Lakers or something. And even though the composition of the team might change over the years, that's still a thing. Or we might say, oh yeah, Time Magazine gave the Man of the Year to Hitler back in 1938. Well, clearly the people who did that aren't the same people running Time Magazine now. And yet, if you're someone who wants to, rail against Time as an institution, you'll bring that up, or to complain about the New York Times and talk about stuff they did 50 years ago. Clearly the staff then is not the people running it today and hiring Paul Krugman, or recently he left. So anyway, do you have a response? But surely isn't there a sense in which you do want to be able to refer to the Boston Celtics as a thing besides just,
well, sure. And at a certain level, yeah, it is a thing, a team, because it doesn't depend on the particular personnel. And that's true of a corporation. Why does a corporation have, it doesn't necessarily have, but can have perpetual life, even though the people are changing and the stockholders are changing and the board of directors are changing. Yeah, that's a convenience. But you also need to be careful about it. I mean, no one at the New York Times was responsible for Walter Duranty's, very dishonest reporting about what Stalin was doing to the Ukraine in the 1930s, right? The starvation. He was reporting that no, there's not famine. Oh, there's a little inconvenience, but it's not so bad, until that got exposed. That guy won a Pulitzer Prize, and the New York Times today still lists it. So those are current staff members who think they should list it. Maybe they think it would be Stalinist to airbrush it out and pretend they didn't get it. So I'm not sure which is worse, leaving it or leaving him there, leaving his name there, or not leaving his name there. But when it comes to moral judgment, if it is totally different people, you can't say, well, 50 years ago, the person who held your job, caused some terrible explosion which killed innocent people. So we're gonna try you now, kill you. I mean, that would be misusing the idea of the abstraction, right? Because how is he responsible for what somebody did 50 years ago, even though he holds the same job? That person should have been punished or paid damages or whatever, and the people responsible for that person being in that job, that's the vicarious liability. But so, I think both things are true. Yes, you can talk about the Celtics, or you can talk about General Motors, but you can also misapply that, right, and use it in an incorrect way. It's like talking about a society, right? We can talk about American society. Well, it's changing all the time. New people are being born, people are dying. This is something liberals have written about, classical liberals have written about for a very long time. Mises and Spencer and people before them understood that while society is they are discrete individuals. If you're calling it a society, you're already indicating there's some sort of ongoing, regularized relationships, right? It's not just a group of people that happen to be in the same place at a particular time and then are going to disperse and not be there. You wouldn't call that a society. So you can talk intelligently about that without compromising methodological individualism or moral individualism either. So that's how I'd approach it.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And again, I just thought that was an interesting nuance that to realize it's complicated. But I do think you're right that these are all true statements we've been making, hopefully, in this episode, and just to show people that it is a nuanced subject. Okay, well, that's a good spot to wrap up. So, Sheldon, you are executive editor of the Libertarian Institute, which showing it's composed of individuals, and yet it is a thing. And where can people go to read?
I believe it's incorporated as a nonprofit.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
Yeah, we believe nonprofits, but we only disbelieve profit making.
Yeah. Where can people go to read your stuff?
Well, libertarianinstitute.org. Very simple. I have a weekly Friday column, TGIF. The goal is freedom. That stands for the goal is freedom. Every Friday. The article that you referred to in the beginning, I don't know if you'll put a link to it, but that appeared a couple of months ago. It's called "Corporate is Not a Four-Letter Word." So
definitely a link to that.
You can search for it there. I also have my own blog, which pretty much mirrors what I put on Libertarian Institute, called Free Association, which has been around since 2005. So 20 years. So you can find it there if you want. But Libertarian Institute has that plus a whole lot more. Scott Horton and a whole bunch of other great people. So I would send you to that one where you'll see much more stuff.
Okay, great. Yeah, and folks, of course, we'll include links to all of that if you go to this episode.
Thank you, Bob.
Well, Sheldon, thanks so much for your time and
my pleasure.
Explain your position.
As usual, I enjoyed it. Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.